I started to live with my girlfriend, but then I found out that she was married to a 60-year-old rich man, so I told him everything and he broke up with her. So I met this girl a while back. It was one of those random things, bumped into her at a coffee shop, started talking, and we hit it off. She was cool, kind of quirky, and didn't seem obsessed with the usual stuff like social media or whatever. We started hanging out, but it was always long distance at first. Texts, calls, that kind of thing. Eventually, we decided to meet up in person more. She'd suggest these weird spots to hang out, empty parks, quiet streets, places with basically no one around. At first, I thought it was odd. Who picks a dead-end alley for a date? But she was into it, and honestly, she was interesting enough that I didn't care too much. It made her stand out, like she had this mysterious vibe going on. We'd walk around, talk about random stuff, and I'd just go with it. She didn't ask much about my life, and I didn't pry into hers. It was chill, or at least I thought so. Things moved fast after a few months. One day, out of nowhere, she asked me to move in with her. I remember sitting there, phone in hand, staring at her text like, what? We'd only hung out in person a handful of times. I barely knew her schedule, her friends, anything real about her. It felt off. Who jumps from casual meetups to, let's live together? That quick? But she had this energy, like she was always up for something wild. I figured she was just impulsive, maybe testing the waters for fun. I told myself it was no big deal, an adventure, like she probably saw it. She suggested we try it for a month, just to see how it went. I wasn't locked in forever, right? So I said yes. She told me not to tell anyone though, not her friends, not mine. Said it'd be our little secret. That should have been a red flag, but I brushed it off. Mysterious girl, mysterious rules. Fine. We found this apartment on the edge of the city. It wasn't fancy, just a small place with creaky floors and thin walls. She handled most of the lease stuff, which I didn't think much about at the time. Moving day came, and we hauled in our boxes. She didn't bring much, just clothes, a laptop, some random junk. I figured she traveled light. The first few days were awkward but fine. We'd cook, watch TV, figure out how to share a bathroom. She acted like everything was normal, like nobody would ever find out we were there. I didn't get why she cared so much about keeping it quiet, but I didn't push. She was still the same girl, funny, a little distant, always keeping me guessing. I thought maybe this was just how she rolled. Living together settled into a routine pretty quick. The apartment was small, so we were always in each other's space, but it wasn't bad at first. She got a job somewhere in the city, a retail gig, she said. She'd leave early, come back late, looking wiped out. I had my own stuff going on, freelancing from home, so I didn't mind the quiet during the day. But then things started shifting. She'd disappear for longer stretches. A day here, a weekend there. Sometimes she'd be gone for weeks. Her excuses were vague, said she had to travel for work, visit other cities, or crash with a friend. She never gave details. No names, no places, nothing. I'd ask where she'd been, and she'd just shrug it off, change the subject. It wasn't like she owed me a play-by-play, but it bugged me. Before we moved in, she always had time to hang out. Now, it was like she was half checked out. I try not to overthink it. People get busy, right? But the longer it went on, the less it added up. She didn't post anything online, no pics, no updates, nothing to clue me in. Her phone was always locked, and she'd step out of the room to take calls. I'd hear her voice through the wall, low and quick, but never caught what she was saying. It wasn't my business, I told myself. We weren't even that serious, just two people trying this living together thing for a month. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling something was off. She'd come back from these trips looking tired but never complained. She'd just crash on the couch, scroll her phone, and act like everything was fine. I started wondering what she was really up to. The apartment felt emptier when she was gone. I'd sit there, working on my laptop, listening to the hum of the fridge. I didn't have much to go on, just her word, which wasn't saying much. I thought about asking her straight up, but she had this way of dodging questions. Made me feel like I was the weird one for caring. So I let it slide for a while. Kept my head down, paid my half of the rent, figured the month would end soon enough. But the more she vanished, the more it gnawed at me. Where was she going? Who was she with? I wasn't jealous, just confused. We'd been close before the move, or at least I thought so. Now, it was like I was living with a stranger who popped in and out when it suited her. The tipping point came about 3 weeks in. She'd been gone for 5 days straight, longest stretch yet. Said it was another work trip, something about inventory in a different city. I didn't buy it anymore. Retail jobs don't send you packing for a week with no notice. I'd stopped asking questions because her answers were always the same, short, empty, nothing to grab onto. But this time, I couldn't let it go. I wasn't mad, just done wondering. I needed to know what was up. So, I decided to follow her. Yeah, it sounds creepy typing it out, but living with someone who's basically a ghost will push you there. I wasn't trying to catch her cheating or anything, just wanted the truth. She left early that morning. I heard her moving around at like 5 a.m., grabbing her bag, shutting the door quiet so I wouldn't wake up. I was already awake though. Waited a few minutes, then got dressed and slipped out after her. The sun wasn't even up yet, just gray light and cold air. She was on foot, heading toward the bus stop a few blocks away. I kept my distance, hood up, hands in my pockets. She didn't look back once. Took the first bus that rolled up, and I hopped on the next one going the same way. It dropped me a couple stops behind her, close enough to see her walking again. She wasn't rushing, just moving steady, like she'd done this 100 times. I tailed her for maybe 20 minutes. She cut through side streets, past strip malls and gas stations, until we hit a nicer part of town. Big houses, manicured lawns, the kind of place I'd never afford. She stopped at this huge, fancy house, 2 stories, white columns, a driveway with a sleek black car parked out front. She pulled out a key, unlocked the door, and went inside like it was nothing. I stood there across the street, half hidden by a tree, trying to process it. This wasn't a friend's place. She didn't knock or call ahead, she had a key. My stomach dropped. I didn't know what it meant yet, but it wasn't good. I stayed there a while, watching the windows. Lights flicked on then off. No one else came out. I didn't have a plan, just turned around and walked back to the apartment, mind racing the whole way. I didn't say anything to her when she got back that night. She rolled in around 8 p.m., dropped her bag by the door, and started heating up leftovers like it was any other day. I sat on the couch, pretending to scroll my phone, but I couldn't focus. That big house was all I could think about, the key, the way she walked in, how it didn't match anything she told me. She asked how my day was, and I mumbled something about work. Kept it short. She didn't push, just ate her food and went to bed early. I stayed up, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out my next move. Confronting her felt pointless, she'd just dodge it like always. But I couldn't keep living there, acting like nothing was wrong. The next day, she was home all morning. Didn't leave for work, didn't disappear. Just hung around, messing with her laptop, humming to herself. I waited until she said she was stepping out to grab groceries. She grabbed her keys and left, same casual vibe as always. I didn't follow her this time. Instead, I told her I had to run an errand too, made up some excuse about picking up a package. She nodded, didn't ask questions, and we went our separate ways. I headed straight for that house. Took the bus again, walked the last few blocks, stood in front of it. Looked even bigger in daylight, fresh paint, trimmed hedges, money written all over it. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I had to see who was there. I knocked on the door. No plan, just a gut feeling. A guy answered, older, maybe 60, gray hair, sharp suit. Looked like he belonged in that house. He didn't seem surprised to see me, just raised an eyebrow and asked what I wanted. I didn't waste time. Told him I'd been living with this girl, that she'd been coming here, that I'd followed her and saw her use a key. Laid it all out, how she'd vanished for days, how she kept everything secret. He listened, arms crossed, face blank. When I finished, he laughed. Not a mean laugh, just loud, like I told him a joke. Said he was her husband, that he'd been married to her for years. Said she'd been pulling this kind of thing before, disappearing, playing games. He didn't sound mad, just tired. Then he told me he was done with her, that I could have her if I wanted. I laughed too, said I didn't want her either. We stood there chuckling like idiots. I left the guy's house feeling lighter than I expected. He didn't give me his name, and I didn't ask. Didn't need to. We'd both been tangled up with her, and that was enough. He shut the door behind me, still shaking his head, and I walked back to the bus stop. The whole thing was so absurd I almost couldn't believe it happened. She'd been married this whole time, to some rich dude twice her age, and I'd been clueless, shacking up with her in that dingy apartment like it was no big deal. I wasn't even mad, just kind of stunned. It explained everything, her disappearing, the secrecy, the key to that mansion. She'd been juggling 2 lives, and I was the side project. When I got back to the apartment, she wasn't there yet. Her grocery excuse probably wasn't real, Another lie to cover wherever she'd gone. I didn't wait around to find out. Started packing my stuff right then. Didn't have much, just clothes, my laptop, some random junk I'd brought over. Fitted all in 2 bags. The place looked emptier without my things, but it didn't feel like home anyway. I left my key on the counter, no note, no explanation. Didn't see the point. She'd figure it out when she walked in. I wasn't planning to stick around for that conversation, knew she'd just spin more stories, and I was done listening. Took my bags and headed to a buddy's place across town. Crashed on his couch that night, told him the short version. He thought it was hilarious, kept saying I'd dodged a bullet. She texted me later that evening. Asked where I was, why my stuff was gone. I didn't reply. Kept my phone on silent and let her messages pile up. There were a bunch, first confused, then annoyed, then nothing. I figured she'd give up eventually. Meanwhile, I kept replaying that laugh with her husband. Guy didn't even seem shocked, like he'd seen her pull this before and was just waiting for it to blow up. Made me wonder how long she'd been at it, living in secret apartments, stringing people along. I didn't feel bad for her. She'd set it all up, played it out, and now it was falling apart. Her husband dumping her was just the cherry on top. I wasn't sticking around to see how she'd handle it. The next couple days were quiet. Stayed at my buddy's place, kept my head down, worked on some freelance gigs to keep busy. She stopped texting after that first night, guess she got the hint. I didn't check in, didn't care to. Whole thing felt like a weird fever dream now that I was out of it. The apartment, her vanishing acts, that mansion, it was all behind me. I started piecing it together though. She must have been using me as some kind of escape, a break from her real life with that guy. Maybe she got off on the secrecy, or maybe she just liked having options. Either way, I wasn't her first rodeo. Her husband's reaction made that clear. He'd laugh like it was old news. Then, out of nowhere, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. Picked it up, and it was him, the husband. His voice was calm, same dry tone from before. Said he'd kicked her out that morning. Told her to pack her stuff and go, no discussion. He'd found my number in her phone, figured I'd want to know how it shook out. Said she didn't fight it, just grabbed her bags and left. He didn't know where she went, didn't care. I could hear him smirking through the phone when he said he'd changed the locks already. Guy was thorough. I told him I'd bailed too, left the apartment same day I talked to him. He laughed again, said we'd both gotten out clean. Asked if I wanted to grab a beer sometime. I said sure, why not? We met up a few days later at this dive bar halfway between his place and the city. He showed up in a plain jacket, no suit this time, looked less like a rich guy, more like someone's chill uncle. Ordered a round, and we started talking. His name was Greg. Been married to her for 6 years, met her when she was working some temp job. Said she'd always been flaky, disappearing for days, making up stories, but he'd let it slide because she'd always come back. This time, though, he was done. My showing up was the last straw. He didn't seem bitter, just relieved. I told him my side, how she'd roped me into moving in, kept everything on the down low. He nodded, said it sounded like her. We finished our beers, ordered another round, and kept swapping stories about her. Felt weirdly good to vent it out with someone who got it. Greg and I met up again a week later. He'd heard from her once since kicking her out, a text asking for money. He didn't reply, just blocked her number. Said he'd already filed for divorce, no point dragging it out. I told him I hadn't heard from her since I left the apartment. My buddy's couch was my spot for now, but I was looking for a new place. Neither of us cared where she'd gone. Greg figured she'd land on her feet, she always had before. We didn't dwell on it. Talked about other stuff instead, work, plans, whatever. Kept it light. Agreed to hang out again sometime. A few days after that, I got a call from the landlord at the apartment. Said she'd moved out too, cleared her stuff, left the key, didn't pay the last week's rent. He was pissed, but I told him I was done with it, not my problem. Guess she'd cut and run once she realized no one was chasing her. I didn't care. Was just glad to be out of that mess. Greg texted me later that week, said he'd found some of her old stuff in his house, random clothes, a spare phone. He tossed it all. Said it felt good to close that chapter. I started settling into my own routine. Found a cheap studio apartment, moved off my buddy's couch. Kept in touch with Greg, grabbed beers every couple weeks. He didn't talk about her much anymore, and I didn't either. She'd vanished from both our lives, and that was fine. No idea where she ended up, and I wasn't curious enough to check. The whole thing, moving in with her, finding out about Greg, watching it all collapse, felt like it happened to someone else now. Greg said the same. We both walked away, and that was that.